I knew something was wrong the moment they raised their glasses beside my husband's portrait before the flowers on his grave had even begun to wilt. Daniel Carter had been gone for 3 days, and the house still smelled like lilies, polished wood, and the black coffee people kept bringing because they did not know what else to do for a widow. His framed photograph sat on the marble fireplace in the great room, the same room where he used to read the Sunday paper in sweatpants while I burned pancakes in the kitchen and pretended I had breakfast under control. Now his family stood around that fireplace in pressed black clothes, speaking in soft voices whenever guests passed by, then laughing the second they thought no one was listening. I stood in the hallway, just beyond the archway, holding the small brass key Daniel had placed in my palm 2 nights before he died. "Do not open the safe until after the will is read," he had whispered, his voice weak but certain. "And Emily, let them show you who they are." At the time, I thought grief had made him dramatic. Daniel had always protected me from his family's sharp little comments, from his mother's frozen smiles, from his father's habit of calling me your wife instead of by my name, from his sister Vanessa's way of looking around our home as if she were mentally measuring the curtains for herself. But standing there that evening, listening to them toast with crystal glasses less than 72 hours after we lowered Daniel into the ground, I finally understood that my husband had not been dramatic at all. He had been warning me. Margaret Carter, my mother-in-law, stood beneath Daniel's portrait like she had already become the lady of the house. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, her pearl earrings shining against the black collar of her dress. She lifted her glass and said, "Daniel finally came back to his real family." Richard, Daniel's father, nodded like a judge approving a sentence. Vanessa gave a tiny laugh and touched the banister of the staircase as if it already belonged to her. "This place always felt wasted on Emily," she said. "She never knew what to do with it. I should have stepped into the room. I should have reminded them that I had lived in that house for 12 years, that I had chosen the blue paint in Daniel's study, planted the hydrangeas by the driveway, sat with him through every fever, every appointment, every sleepless night when his hands shook too badly to hold a glass of water. I should have told them that family was not measured by bloodlines or last names or who could smile the prettiest at a funeral. But I did not move. I only tightened my fingers around the brass key until its teeth pressed into my skin. On the side table near me sat the sympathy cards from neighbors, co-workers, old college friends, and people from Daniel's company who had cried harder at the funeral than his own relatives. One card had a line inside that I kept reading over and over: "Daniel always said you were the reason he kept fighting." I wanted to believe that. I wanted to hold on to the idea that our life together had meant more than whatever papers would be read in some attorney's office downtown. Then Margaret's voice floated into the hallway again, light and satisfied. "The lawyer said Thursday morning," she told them. "After that, we can finally put things in order." "Good," Richard replied. "The company needs a Carter in control, not a grieving wife who never understood business." Vanessa sighed as if she had been waiting years for this moment. "I call the upstairs suite. The one with the balcony. My bedroom. Our bedroom. The room where Daniel had asked me to dance with him last Christmas even though he could barely stand for one song." I looked toward the staircase, toward the framed wedding photo on the landing that Margaret had always hated because Daniel was smiling at me instead of the camera. For a second, grief rose so sharply in my throat that I thought I might fall apart right there on the hardwood floor. But then I remembered Daniel's last words again. "Let them show you who they are." So I stepped backward into the shadow of the hallway and let them celebrate. I let them divide rooms, imagine bank accounts, discuss the company, and speak about me like I had already been erased from Daniel's life. What they did not know was that Daniel had planned for this night long before they arrived with their covered dishes and fake tears. What they did not know was that the key in my hand opened a safe behind the shelves in his study. And what they absolutely did not know was that the most important part of Daniel Carter's will was not on the first page, where they expected their victory to begin. It was waiting at the very end. The next morning, the house felt colder than it had during the funeral. The sun came through the tall windows in thin pale stripes, landing across the living room rug Daniel and I had bought on a trip to Vermont 8 years earlier. I was standing in the kitchen, staring at a mug of coffee I had not touched, when Margaret walked in wearing one of her cream cardigans, the kind she chose when she wanted people to think she was gentle. She looked around the kitchen like she was inspecting a rental property after careless tenants had moved out. "Emily," she said, folding her hands in front of her, "we need to talk about practical things." I did not answer right away. I had learned over 12 years that Margaret never started with the real sentence. She circled it first, wrapped it in manners, then waited for the knife to sound like advice. Richard came in behind her with a yellow legal pad, and Vanessa followed with a travel mug and sunglasses pushed on top of her head, even though she had no intention of leaving soon. They stood together on the other side of the island, 3 Carters lined up in my kitchen as if I were the visitor. Margaret gave me a sad little smile. "This house is too much for one person." I looked past her toward the hallway, where Daniel's jacket still hung on the hook near the back door. He had worn it the last time we sat on the porch together, wrapped in a blanket, watching the first leaves turn gold. "I have lived here for 12 years, I said quietly. Richard tapped his pen against the legal pad. "That is understood, but the property has always been part of the Carter estate. Sentiment does not change structure." Structure. That was the word he used when he wanted to make cruelty sound professional. Vanessa walked to the refrigerator and opened it without asking. "Do you still have that sparkling water Daniel liked?" she asked, as if Daniel were away on a business trip instead of gone forever. Margaret ignored her and continued. "We are not asking you to leave today. No one wants to be unkind." That was when I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because unkindness had filled that house from the moment they arrived, slipping under doors, settling on furniture, touching every room Daniel and I had built a life in. "How generous," I said. Margaret's smile tightened. Richard looked down at his pad. "We think a week is reasonable. 2 at most. It will give you time to gather your belongings and find a smaller place. Perhaps something closer to town. An apartment would be easier for you." Vanessa closed the refrigerator and leaned against the counter. "Honestly, you might like it. Less upkeep. No big yard. No stairs. This place is almost 6,000 square feet. It never really suited you." I looked at her then, really looked at her. Vanessa had spent years walking through my home with the hungry eyes of someone browsing a catalogue. She had always loved the upstairs suite, the balcony, the wide bathroom with the clawfoot tub Daniel had surprised me with on our anniversary. She had once joked that if I ever got tired of being married to her brother, she would gladly take the house off my hands. Daniel had heard it and never invited her to stay overnight again. Now she was back, touching the marble counter with her manicured fingers, pretending patience while counting rooms in her head. Margaret reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded paper. We also made a preliminary list of items that should remain with the family. Daniel's watches, his father's desk, the silver from my mother, the artwork in the dining room. "The dining room artwork was my wedding gift from Daniel," I said. "Yes," Margaret replied softly, "but bought with Carter money." I felt something inside me go very still. Not anger. Not fear. Something quieter and stronger. Daniel's voice came back to me again, thin from illness but steady with purpose. "Let them show you who they are." So I let them. I let Richard explain how. The company needed stability. I let Margaret suggest that grief could cloud judgment. I let Vanessa ask whether I planned to keep all of Daniel's clothes or whether she could have his leather overnight bag because it was too nice to sit in a closet. I answered almost nothing. I only listened, because every word they spoke seemed to confirm a truth Daniel had known before I was ready to see it. By noon, Margaret had moved a vase of white roses from the entry table to the fireplace, saying the old placement was too casual. Richard had taken a phone call in Daniel's study and closed the door behind him. Vanessa had gone upstairs, and when I followed the sound of her footsteps, I found her standing in my bedroom doorway, staring at the balcony doors. She turned and smiled without shame. "You know," she said, "with different curtains, this room could be beautiful." I looked at the bed where Daniel had held my hand on his last good morning, at the window where we had watched snow cover the lawn one January night, at the walls that still seemed to remember his laughter. Then I looked back at Vanessa and said, "It already is." She rolled her eyes and walked past me, brushing my shoulder like I was in her way. I stayed there alone for a moment, gripping the brass key in my pocket. The safe was still unopened behind the shelves in Daniel's study. Thursday was still 2 days away. And until then, I understood exactly what my husband had asked of me. I was not supposed to stop them. I was supposed to remember everything. By late afternoon, Margaret changed her strategy from cold instruction to polished kindness, and somehow that felt worse. She found me in the sunroom, where Daniel used to keep a stack of books he always meant to finish. I was sitting in his old leather chair with the brass key hidden in the pocket of my cardigan, watching the backyard maple shift in the wind. Margaret knocked softly on the open doorframe, though she had never knocked in this house before. "Emily," she said, her voice smooth and careful, "I think this morning became more emotional than anyone intended." I looked up at her and waited. She stepped into the room carrying a silver tray. With 2 cups of tea, the same tray she had once told me was too delicate for everyday use when I served coffee on it at Thanksgiving. Behind her, Vanessa appeared with her phone in one hand, pretending to scroll but holding it at an angle that told me everything. Richard stood in the hallway, close enough to hear every word, far enough to pretend he was not part of it. Margaret placed the tray on the small table between us and lowered herself into the chair across from me. "We are all grieving," she said. "People say things they do not mean when grief is fresh." Vanessa gave a soft hum of agreement without looking up from her phone. I glanced at the black screen and saw my own reflection in it. She was recording. I folded my hands in my lap and said nothing. Margaret took a slow breath, as if she had practiced this speech in the mirror. "The most respectful thing we can do for Daniel is avoid conflict. Courtrooms, lawyers, public disputes, those things would only damage his memory." "The will has not even been read yet," I said. "Exactly," Richard said from the hallway, stepping in as if he had been invited. "That is why we can settle certain matters privately, like a family." The word family landed between us like a coin dropped on a table. Margaret reached into a cream-colored folder and pulled out several pages clipped together. "This is not anything harsh," she said quickly. "It is simply a family understanding. You would acknowledge that Daniel's long-term assets, the house, the company interests, and the Carter family pieces should remain with his blood relatives. In return, we would help you transition comfortably." Vanessa finally looked up. "Mom means generously." I looked at the papers but did not touch them. "How generous?" Richard cleared his throat. "A one-time payment of $25,000, moving expenses, and we would not contest you keeping your personal belongings." For a moment, the room became so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hall. $25,000. That was what they thought 12 years of marriage was worth. That was what they thought of the nights I slept in hospital chairs, the mornings I drove Daniel 2 hours to specialists, the months I ran payroll from his bedside when he was too sick to open his laptop. Margaret pushed the papers closer. "It is more than fair, Emily. You are still young enough to start over." Vanessa lifted her phone a little higher. I understood the trap then. If I cried, I would be unstable. If I raised my voice, I would be greedy. If I refused too sharply, they would have a recording of the unreasonable widow trying to destroy Daniel's family. Daniel had known them better than I ever wanted to. So I picked up the top page slowly, not to sign it, only to read. The language was polite, almost tender, but every sentence had teeth. I would waive any claim to the residence. I would make no public statement about the Carter family. I would remove myself from all business matters. I would surrender Daniel's personal documents, devices, and financial records. At the bottom, beneath a blank signature line, my name had already been typed. Emily Ann Carter. Seeing my married name there, used like a handle on a suitcase they wanted to carry out of their lives, made my chest tighten. Margaret leaned forward. Daniel would not have wanted fighting. I looked at her then. Daniel would have wanted honesty. Her expression flickered, just for a second. Richard's pen stopped tapping against his folder. Vanessa's thumb froze on the side of her phone. I set the paper back on the table, perfectly straight. I am not signing anything before Thursday. Margaret's mouth hardened. You may regret making this difficult. Maybe, I said. But I will regret disrespecting my husband more. Vanessa gave a short laugh. You are acting like you know something we do not. I stood, picked up my untouched tea, and carried it to the tray. My hands were steady, which seemed to bother them more than anger would have. No, I said softly. I am acting like someone who can wait 2 days. I walked past Richard and into the hallway, feeling all three of them watching me. The safe behind Daniel's study shelves remained closed. The key remained in my pocket. And now I had one more thing Daniel had asked me to collect without saying the words out loud, proof of. Exactly how far they would go when they believed no one could stop them. That evening, Margaret decided the house needed a proper family dinner, which was a strange thing to call a meal where the woman who had buried her husband 3 days earlier was treated like an unwanted guest. By 6 o'clock, the dining room was glowing with candles, polished silver, and the long mahogany table Daniel and I had only used on holidays because he said it made even sandwiches feel like a board meeting. Margaret had opened the good wine without asking me. Richard had invited his financial advisor, a thin man named Paul who kept glancing at the artwork as if estimating its value, and Vanessa had brought her husband, Mark, who smiled too much and spoke too little. 2 of Daniel's cousins came as well, along with Aunt Carol, the only person in the room who hugged me like she meant it. I had not been asked whether I wanted people in my home. I had not been asked whether I could handle a dinner. I simply walked downstairs and found my dining room filled with voices, clinking glasses, and the smell of roasted chicken from the caterer Margaret had called because, as she told someone in the foyer, Emily should not be expected to manage much right now. They seated me near the far end of the table, 3 chairs away from the place Daniel always saved for me. Margaret took the head chair, Daniel's chair, and placed one pale hand beside the wineglass like she had been waiting years for the table to arrange itself around her. I looked at that chair and remembered Daniel tapping his fork against the rim of his glass every Thanksgiving before making a terrible speech about gratitude, usually so bad that everyone laughed despite themselves. No one laughed that way now. This laughter was thinner, sharper, full of relief they were trying to hide under sympathy. Richard leaned toward Paul and said, "Once Thursday is behind us, we can begin evaluating the company's options." Daniel was sentimental. I am not. Paul nodded and asked whether the family intended to keep controlling interest. Margaret answered before Richard could. Of course. The company is a Carter legacy. Vanessa lifted her glass. And the house. Her eye slid toward me. Some legacies should stay where they belong. Aunt Carol shifted in her seat and gave Vanessa a warning look, but Vanessa only smiled. I kept my hands folded in my lap. My plate sat untouched in front of me. Across the table, Mark asked if the upstairs suite had the balcony facing the maple tree. Vanessa laughed softly and said, "Yes, and I already have ideas. That room needs a complete refresh." My cousin by marriage, Thomas, cleared his throat. "Is that Emily's room?" The silence that followed was small but noticeable. Margaret took a sip of wine. For now. Those 2 words moved through the room like cold air. For now. As if my marriage had been a temporary rental agreement. As if the vows Daniel and I made, the mortgage payments we made together, the mornings I spent helping him button his shirts when his hands became too weak, could all be reduced to a schedule they had created without me. Richard turned to me then, his voice smooth enough for company. "Emily, no one wants you to feel pushed. But practical matters do not wait because feelings are uncomfortable." "Richard," Aunt Carol said quietly. "Not tonight." Margaret smiled at her. "Carol, pretending reality does not exist will not help anyone." Then she looked down the table at me, her expression full of rehearsed pity. "Emily knows we are trying to make this easier. She has always been sensitive, and Daniel protected her from difficult things. I felt the brass key in my pocket press against my thigh. Sensitive. That was what they called me when I noticed disrespect. Difficult. That was what they called the truth when it inconvenienced them. Vanessa reached for the breadbasket and said, "Honestly, Mom, Emily might feel better once she is somewhere smaller. This house probably reminds her of everything she lost." "It reminds me of everything I built with Daniel," I said. My voice was quiet, but every face turned toward me. Margaret's smile thinned. "Of course. But memories are not deeds, dear." Paul looked down at his plate. Mark took a long drink of water. Aunt Carol closed her eyes for half a second. Vanessa leaned back, enjoying herself. Then, Margaret stood, walked to the sideboard, and picked up a white envelope I had not noticed before. She carried it to me with the solemn grace of someone presenting an award. "We discussed it," she said, placing it beside my plate. "This is enough to cover a deposit on an apartment and a few months of expenses. No one can say we sent you away with nothing." The room went painfully still. I looked at the envelope. I did not touch it. I could feel everyone waiting for me to cry, to shout, to give Vanessa another recording, to become the version of me they needed in order to justify what they were doing. Instead, I lifted my eyes to Margaret and asked, "Do you want everyone here to remember this conversation tomorrow?" Her chin rose. "I have nothing to be ashamed of." Richard set down his fork. Vanessa smiled into her glass. I nodded once. "Then I hope everyone remembers it clearly." Margaret returned to Daniel's chair, satisfied because she thought she had won the room. But as the dinner continued around me, as they discussed appraisals, renovations, stock options, and who should contact the estate attorney first thing in the morning, I felt Daniel's warning settle into something almost peaceful inside me. They were not just showing me who they were anymore. They were showing everyone. Thursday morning arrived with a kind of silence that made every sound feel too sharp. The house was awake before 7 o'clock, though no one admitted they had slept badly. I heard Margaret moving through the hallway in low heels, opening and closing doors as if she were already taking inventory. Richard spoke on the phone in Daniel's study, using that firm business voice he saved for people he wanted to impress. Vanessa came downstairs carrying a garment bag over one arm, dressed in a navy suit and pearl necklace, looking less like a grieving sister and more like a woman preparing for a victory photograph. I stood in the upstairs hallway outside my bedroom, wearing the simple black dress Daniel had always said made me look stronger than I felt. In my pocket was the brass key. On my left hand was my wedding ring. I had not opened the safe. I had not touched the envelope Margaret left beside my plate the night before. I had not moved a single item from the bedroom Vanessa wanted so badly. Before leaving, I walked into Daniel's study and stood in front of the tall built-in shelves behind his desk. The morning light fell across his chair, his fountain pen, his reading glasses, and the framed photograph of us at Cape Cod, both of us windblown and laughing with our shoes full of sand. Behind the third shelf from the left, hidden by old tax files and a row of history books, was the safe he had told me about. I placed my fingers against the wood, feeling the seam I had never noticed before. For a moment, I wanted to turn the key right then and know everything. But Daniel had been clear. Not until after the will was read. So I stepped back and whispered, "I am waiting, just like you asked." Downstairs, Margaret was arranging everyone near the front door as if she were leading a family delegation. Richard had printed directions to the attorney's office even though everyone had phones. Vanessa was typing quickly, her thumbs moving with excitement she did not try hard enough to hide. When she saw me, she tilted her screen away. "Just updating a friend," she said. "People are concerned." I did not ask what she had written. I already knew the shape of it. Poor Emily. Difficult Emily. Emily who refused to be reasonable. Emily who needed to accept reality. Aunt Carol arrived a few minutes later in a grey coat, carrying a small paper bag from the bakery Daniel loved. She handed it to me without making a scene. "You probably have not eaten," she said softly. It was the first kind sentence I had heard in 2 days, and it nearly broke me more than any insult had. Margaret watched the exchange with irritation hidden beneath manners. "Carol, you did not need to come. This is really an immediate family matter." Aunt Carol looked at her calmly. "Daniel was my nephew. Emily is his wife. That is immediate enough for me." No one answered that. Outside, the air was crisp, and the driveway was lined with cars that did not belong to people coming to comfort me. Richard walked ahead with Paul, the financial advisor, both of them discussing valuation timelines as if Daniel's life had been a folder waiting to be processed. Margaret paused beside me before stepping into her car. "Emily," she said, lowering her voice, "whatever happens today, I hope you behave with dignity." I looked at her face, at the woman who had sat in my husband's chair, offered me money to leave my own home, and smiled while her daughter planned my bedroom. "I intend to," I said. She studied me for a second, perhaps waiting for fear, perhaps hoping for anger. When she found neither, she turned away. The attorney's office was 40 minutes away in downtown Hartford, on the 12th floor of a glass building that overlooked the river. Daniel had chosen James Whitmore years ago, not because he was flashy, but because he was careful. The waiting room smelled faintly of leather and lemon polish. Margaret sat with her ankles crossed, hands folded over her purse. Richard stood near the window, checking emails. Vanessa whispered to Mark that she hoped this would not take all morning because she had a contractor coming by the house next week to look at possibilities. Aunt Carol sat beside me and pressed the bakery bag gently into my hands. "Whatever is in that room," she said, "remember who Daniel was when no one else was watching." Before I could answer, the conference room door opened, and James Whitmore stepped out. He was tall, grey-haired, and solemn, with a blue folder tucked under one arm and an expression I could not read. His eyes moved over the room, paused on Margaret, Richard, Vanessa, and then settled on me. For the first time all morning, I saw something in someone's face that looked almost like sympathy and almost like warning. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly. "Everyone is ready for you now." Margaret stood first. Richard straightened his jacket. Vanessa slipped her phone into her purse but kept her hand around it. I rose last, carrying grief, the brass key, and 2 days of their own words behind me. As we entered the conference room, Margaret walked in with the confidence of a woman arriving to claim what she believed was already hers. I followed without rushing, because Daniel had told me to wait until the end, and for the first time since his death, the end was close enough to feel. The conference room looked too ordinary for a moment that would decide the shape of the rest of my life. There was a long walnut table, 12 black leather chairs, a pitcher of ice water, several glasses, and a wall of windows facing the grey river below. James Whitmore took the seat at the head of the table and placed the blue folder in front of him with careful hands. Margaret sat to his right, as close to authority as she could get. Richard sat beside her with Paul and a leather notebook already open. Vanessa sat across from me, phone face down but within reach, her wedding ring flashing each time she tapped one nail against the table. Mark sat next to her, looking uncomfortable for the first time since he had entered my house. Aunt Carol chose the chair beside me without asking anyone's permission. I could feel the brass key in my pocket like a heartbeat. James adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. "Before we begin," he said, "I want to remind everyone that this reading concerns the estate planning documents of Daniel Robert Carter, signed and witnessed while he was fully competent and under no pressure from any party." Richard nodded impatiently. "Of course." Margaret added, "Daniel was always careful with paperwork." James looked at her for a second longer than necessary, then opened the folder. The first pages sounded exactly like what they wanted to hear. Daniel left certain family keepsakes to his parents, his grandfather's pocket watch, a set of old photographs, his college rowing medals, and the walnut desk Richard had already tried to claim from the study. Margaret dabbed at the corner of one eye with a tissue, though no tear had fallen. Richard looked satisfied, as if furniture had confirmed bloodline. James continued. Vanessa was named to receive a small collection of Daniel's art prints and a cash gift of $50,000, provided all estate conditions are met. Vanessa's head lifted at the amount, but I noticed the phrase James had added with deliberate clarity. Provided all estate conditions are met. Richard did not seem to hear it. Margaret certainly did not. They were hearing only numbers, objects, permission. Then James read that Daniel had allocated a $100,000 education fund for any future children of Vanessa and Mark, again subject to conditions described later. Vanessa smiled at Mark like the morning had already turned in her favor. Paul wrote something down. Richard leaned back in his chair, more relaxed now, and asked whether the company's shares were listed next. James turned another page. Daniel's interest in Carter Ridge Holdings, including voting rights, board authority, and related investment accounts, will be addressed in a subsequent section. Good, Richard said under his breath. Margaret gave him a warning glance, but she was smiling too. I sat still, listening as if I were listening from underwater. Daniel's name kept being spoken as a legal subject instead of a man who had once left sticky notes on the coffee maker for me, reminding me to eat breakfast. James continued through bank accounts, life insurance, the house, charitable gifts, taxes, and instructions for personal letters. Every so often, a sentence ended with that same phrase, subject to conditions described later, but the others moved past it like speed bumps on a road they were sure led home. Then James reached a page that made Margaret sit taller. The primary residence located in West Hartford, Connecticut, including the land, furnishings, and attached holdings, shall remain occupied according to the terms set forth in the final directive. Vanessa's eyes brightened. Richard's pen moved quickly. Margaret's lips curved just enough for me to see it. So it remains within the estate structure, Richard said. James did not answer him directly. I will ask that no one interpret partial language before the document is complete. That should have slowed them down, but greed has a way of making warnings sound like background noise. Margaret turned slightly toward me, her voice gentle for the room. Emily, I hope you understand now why we wanted to handle things gracefully. Aunt Carol's hand tightened around mine beneath the table. I looked at Margaret, then at the folder in front of James. I understand more than you think. Vanessa gave a tiny laugh, but James did not smile. He turned another page, then another, and his tone became heavier. We have now reached the conditional provisions. Richard frowned. Conditional in what sense? James folded his hands on top of the document. In the sense that Mr. Carter did not intend inheritance to reward conduct he considered dishonorable. The room changed then. Not loudly. No one shouted. No one stood. But something moved through the air, a quiet shift from celebration to uncertainty. Margaret lowered her tissue. Richard stopped writing. Vanessa's fingers closed around her phone. James looked at each of them before continuing. Daniel included a final directive that governs the house, the company, the investment accounts, and all gifts assigned to immediate family members. Margaret's voice sharpened. Final directive. James looked down at the page, then back up. Yes. The last page. I felt the key in my pocket, cold and solid. Daniel had brought us all to the edge exactly as he promised. And for the first time that morning, his family stopped smiling. James Whitmore did not read the final directive quickly. He lifted the page with both hands, as if Daniel's last instruction deserved more respect than the impatience sitting around that table. Margaret stared at the paper with a tight expression, Richard leaned forward, and Vanessa's mouth parted slightly, the confidence draining from her face before a single sentence had been completed. James began, to my parents, Richard and Margaret Carter, to my sister, Vanessa Carter, and to any person who believes my death changes the meaning of my marriage, I leave this final condition. No one moved. Even the ice in the water pitcher seemed to stop settling. James continued, his voice steady. Any inheritance, property access, company authority, financial distribution, or personal gift described in previous sections shall be valid only if, during the 30 days following my passing, my wife, Emily Ann Carter, is treated with dignity, privacy, and full respect as my lawful spouse and chosen next of kin. Margaret blinked once, very slowly. Richard's jaw tightened. Vanessa whispered, "What does that mean?" James did not look up yet. Any attempt to remove Emily from the marital residence, pressure her into signing documents, publicly diminish her role in my life, claim ownership of rooms, assets, or company matters before legal completion, or celebrate expected inheritance in a manner that humiliates my wife shall trigger immediate forfeiture of all conditional gifts. Aunt Carol's hand found mine beneath the table again, but this time she was not comforting me. She was holding on as if the room itself had shifted. Richard's voice came out flat. "That cannot be enforceable." James finally looked at him. "It was drafted with significant care." Margaret laughed once, a thin, disbelieving sound. Daniel would never write something so insulting about his own family. James turned the page slightly. Mr. Carter anticipated that response. He reached into the blue folder and removed a smaller sealed envelope with Daniel's signature across the flap. My breath caught at the sight of it. I knew that handwriting. I knew the way his capital D leaned a little too far to the right. James opened it and read, "If they are offended by this condition, James, remind them that respect costs nothing. If they could not afford even that, they were never entitled to what I built." Vanessa sank back into her chair. Mark looked down at the table. Paul, the financial advisor, stopped writing completely. Richard stood halfway, then sat again when James raised one hand. "There is more," James said. "Mr. Carter also instructed me to document any evidence relevant to the condition, including conduct witnessed before or after his death." Margaret's eyes cut toward me. "You did this?" I shook my head. "I did not write his will." "But you poisoned him against us," she said, her voice losing its softness for the first time. The words hung there, ugly and desperate, and James looked at her with the calm of a man who had expected exactly that. "Mrs. Carter," he said to Margaret, "Daniel began preparing these provisions 11 months ago." 11 months! I felt the number move through me like a door opening. 11 months ago, Daniel had still been sitting at the kitchen table with a blanket around his shoulders, pretending to read quarterly reports while watching me make soup. 11 months ago, I had believed we still had more time. James placed another document on the table. He provided written statements, emails, company records, and personal notes explaining why these conditions mattered to him. Richard's face changed at the mention of company records. "Those are private business documents. They are part of his estate file," James said. "And they are relevant because Daniel wanted the record to reflect the truth. Emily did not marry into Carter Ridge Holdings as an outsider looking for security. During the company's liquidity crisis 3 years ago, Emily contributed $240,000 from her separate inheritance, without requesting public credit, while several family members declined to assist." My hands went cold. I had never told Margaret. I had never told Richard. Daniel had promised me he would not, because I had not done it for applause. Vanessa looked at me as if seeing a stranger. Margaret turned pale beneath her makeup. James continued, "Daniel also noted that Emily managed payroll, vendor negotiations, medical scheduling, and household finances during his illness, often while certain relatives questioned her right to remain in the home." Richard said nothing. Margaret's tissue sat crumpled in her fist. Vanessa's phone remained untouched now. The room that had felt like a courtroom moments earlier had become something quieter and worse for them, a mirror. James slid one final item from the folder, a small black flash drive sealed in a plastic sleeve. "Before we proceed to enforcement," he said, "Daniel requested that this be played for everyone present." My heart began to pound. Margaret looked at the flash drive, then at me, then back at James. "No," she said softly. "Whatever that is, it is unnecessary." James held her gaze. It was Daniel's final recorded instruction. And in that moment, I understood why he had told me not to open the safe before the will was read. The paper was only the beginning. Daniel had left them his words, and there was nowhere left for them to hide. James connected the flash drive to the conference room screen, and for a few seconds there was only a dark reflection of all of us sitting around the table. I saw Margaret frozen with her tissue in one hand, Richard staring forward as if silence could still put him back in control, Vanessa pale and motionless, and myself sitting beside Aunt Carol with my wedding ring pressed against my palm. Then Daniel appeared on the screen. He was sitting in his study, in the brown leather chair near the window, wearing the navy sweater I had bought for him because he was always cold near the end. His face was thinner than I remembered wanting to admit, but his eyes were clear, and when he looked into the camera, the whole room seemed to forget how to breathe. "If you are watching this," Daniel said, "then I am gone, and the people in this room have reached the part of my will I hoped would never be necessary." My chest tightened so sharply that Aunt Carol placed her hand over mine. Daniel continued, "Emily, I am sorry you had to sit through this. I know you probably stayed quiet because I asked you to. I know that was not fair. But I needed the truth to stand on its own, without anyone claiming you created it." Margaret looked down at the table, but there was nowhere to hide from his voice. "Mom, Dad, Vanessa," Daniel said, pausing between their names. "I loved you because you were my family, but love never made me blind. I heard the comments you made when you thought I was asleep. I saw the way you treated my wife when I was too tired to defend her properly. I knew you believed the house, the company, and the money should return to what you called the real Carters. You were wrong. Emily was not a guest in my life. She was the life I chose." Vanessa covered her mouth, but no sound came out. Richard's expression had gone hard, though his hand trembled slightly near his notebook. On the screen, Daniel took a slow breath. 3 years ago, when Carter Ridge Holdings was weeks from missing payroll, Emily used $240,000 from her own inheritance to keep my employees paid. She did not ask for her name on a plaque. She did not ask for shares. She only asked me not to let people lose their jobs before Christmas. Dad, you told me the company needed discipline. Mom, you said it was not your problem. Vanessa, you asked whether we could still host Thanksgiving at the house because you had already invited friends. Paul, the financial advisor, shifted uncomfortably. Richard stared at the table now. Daniel's voice remained calm, which somehow made every word heavier. During my illness, Emily became the person who held every broken piece together. She tracked medications, insurance, payroll, vendor contracts, taxes, home repairs, and every doctor appointment within 100 miles. She did it while smiling for me because she did not want me to feel like a burden. And while she was doing that, some of you were already asking questions about what would happen to the house after I died. Margaret whispered, Daniel, as if he could hear her. The screen did not forgive her. So I made a decision, he continued. I would not leave my wife at the mercy of people waiting for her grief to make her weak. The conditions in my will are not punishment. They are a test of character. If you treated Emily with dignity, you would receive more than enough. If you pressured her, insulted her, pushed her out of her home, or celebrated before my body was cold, then you would receive exactly what your behavior earned. I closed my eyes for 1 second, and tears slipped down my face, not because I felt victorious, but because Daniel had seen everything. He had carried the truth quietly, lovingly, and with a precision that broke my heart all over again. When I opened my eyes, Daniel leaned closer to the camera. Emily, the key I gave you opens the safe behind the shelves. Inside are the final letters, the company transfer documents, and the house deed instructions. James will guide you through everything. Do not let anyone tell you that peace requires surrender. Peace sometimes begins when you stop apologizing for being the rightful person in the room. Margaret made a small sound, but James did not stop the video. Daniel looked tired then, but there was a faint smile at the corner of his mouth, the one I had loved most. And to my family, if you are angry right now, ask yourselves why. Ask yourselves whether you are grieving me, or grieving what you thought you were about to receive. If you celebrated too soon, that was your choice. Emily did not take anything from you. You gave it away before the last page was even read. The screen went black. No one spoke. The room was full of people who had entered believing they were there to collect Daniel's life, and now they were sitting inside the truth he had left behind. James removed his glasses, folded them slowly, and turned back to the document. Under the terms Daniel Carter established, he said, the conditional gifts assigned to Richard Carter, Margaret Carter, and Vanessa Carter are now subject to forfeiture review based on documented conduct from the past 48 hours. Vanessa's phone buzzed once against the table, and for the first time, she did not reach for it. Margaret stared at me as if I had become someone she should have feared from the beginning. But I was not the one who had changed. I was only the one Daniel had finally allowed them to see. James Whitmore gave the room several seconds to absorb what Daniel had left behind, and those seconds felt longer than the 40-minute drive that had brought us there. Margaret was the first to speak, but her voice no longer carried the careful authority she had worn like perfume all week. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "Daniel was emotional when he made that recording. He was ill. He was not thinking clearly." James placed his glasses back on and looked at her with professional calm. "Mrs. Carter, Daniel completed the recording, the written directive, and the supporting documents over several months. His physician provided confirmation of his mental clarity at the time of each signing." Richard pushed his notebook away. "You cannot seriously claim a family dinner and a few uncomfortable conversations are enough to cancel estate gifts." James opened a second folder. "The directive does not rely on one conversation. It refers to a pattern of conduct, and the most recent events appear to satisfy the trigger conditions." Vanessa finally grabbed her phone, her fingers moving quickly, then stopping as her face changed. I knew without seeing the screen that she was looking at messages she had sent too early, words typed with too much confidence, proof created by her own excitement. James continued, "The primary residence, Daniel Carter's controlling interest in Carter Ridge Holdings, the attached investment accounts, and all final authority over personal estate documents passed to Emily and Carter. Conditional gifts assigned to Richard Carter, Margaret Carter, and Vanessa Carter will be suspended pending formal review, and based on the evidence provided, Mr. Carter's instructions are clear." Margaret turned toward me, not with sadness, not with regret, but with the stunned anger of someone who had expected me to disappear quietly and instead found me sitting where Daniel had placed me. "Emily," she said, trying to soften my name into a request, "surely you do not want this. You do not want to tear the family apart." I looked at her for a long moment. I thought of her in my dining room, sitting in Daniel's chair. I thought of the envelope beside my plate, the apartment deposit, the list of items she believed I should surrender, Vanessa standing in my bedroom doorway planning new curtains. "I did not tear anything apart," I said. "I only waited until the end." Aunt Carol let out a quiet breath beside me. Richard looked toward Paul, but Paul had closed his notebook and seemed very interested in the river outside the window. Vanessa whispered, "What about the upstairs suite?" Mark gave her a look so tired and embarrassed that she finally lowered her eyes. James slid several documents toward me. "Emily, Daniel instructed that after this reading, you may open the safe at the residence. Inside are personal letters, the original house deed instructions, company transfer paperwork, and a separate note for you. I will accompany you through each step when you are ready." I touched the top page but did not sign immediately. The victory they had imagined was loud, full of wine glasses, appraisals, rooms, and control. The one Daniel gave me was quiet. It felt like air returning to a room after all the windows had been locked shut. I signed where? James indicated, my hand steady, my wedding ring catching the light with each movement. Margaret watched the pen as if every stroke removed another piece of the future she had already spent. When it was done, James gathered the papers and said, "The house remains Emily's legal residence. No one may remove property, enter private rooms, or contact staff, contractors, or company representatives on behalf of the estate without her written permission." Richard stood without a word. Margaret remained seated a moment longer, staring at Daniel's black screen, as if she expected him to come back and soften what he had said. Vanessa wiped at her eyes, but it was impossible to tell whether she was grieving Daniel or the life she had announced too soon. I stood slowly, and Aunt Carol stood with me. At the door, Margaret said, "He was our son before he was your husband." I turned back, not angry, not shaking, not afraid. "And he was my husband until his last breath," I said. "He made sure you remembered that." No one followed us into the hallway. Aunt Carol walked with me to the elevator, and neither of us spoke until the doors closed. Then she reached for my hand and said, "He loved you well." I looked down at the brass key in my palm, the key I had carried through humiliation, silence, and the final truth. "Yes," I said. He did. When I returned home that afternoon, the house was still. Daniel's portrait remained on the fireplace, the white roses had begun to droop, and the envelope Margaret left at dinner still sat untouched on the sideboard. I walked past it, up the stairs, into Daniel's study, and opened the hidden safe. Inside were the documents James had described, a stack of letters tied with blue ribbon, and one envelope with my name written in Daniel's hand. I held it against my chest before I opened it. For the first time since the funeral, I did not feel like I had been left alone inside a house full of ghosts. I felt protected. Daniel had not given me revenge. He had given me the truth, the home we built, and permission to keep living without begging anyone to recognize my place in his life.